Chapter 9. The Quran on Women, Crooked and Inferior. The Quran values women. Two Quranic scholars, Amatul Rahman Omar and Abdul Manan Omar, in an article entitled Introduction to the Study of the Holy Quran, assert that the concept of some Christians about the rights of women in Islam is based upon colossal ignorance of the teachings of the Quran and Islam. I would agree. Some Westerners, Christian and non-Christian, have a completely distorted and inaccurate view about the rights of women in Islam. And these misconceptions are indeed based on ignorance of the Quran and Islam. But who are ignorant? The ones who believe the Quran is a marvelous, progressive tract about advancing women's rights? Or those who believe the Quran has been used all too often to justify the oppression of women? To find out, let's look at the 81st chapter of the Quran, which begins with a stark litany of the cataclysmic events of the Day of Judgment. When the sun is overthrown, and when the stars fall, and when the hills are moved, and when the camels big with young are abandoned, and when the wild beasts are herded together, and when the seas rise, and when the souls are reunited. Surah 81, verses 1 through 7. The image that immediately follows is even more arresting. And when the girl child that was buried alive is asked, for what sin she was slain. Surah 81, verses 8 and 9. Both Muslim and non-Muslim apologists for Islam point proudly to this passage to show that the Quran put an end to the pagan Arab practice of female infanticide. And indeed, this is a minor preoccupation of the Quran. In another place, the book excoriates those whose faces become darkened when they receive news of the birth of a girl, and who consider burying her beneath the dust. Verily evil is their judgment. Surah 16, verses 58 and 59. Allah tells the Muslims, slay not your children because of penury. Surah 6, verse 151. The same apologists often make sweeping claims about the Quran's supposedly benevolent teachings on women. Late in 2005, English judge Marilyn Morrington spoke in Islamabad at a seminar entitled Violence Against Women and Criminal Justice System, Challenge and Response. Morrington stated there that Islam is a religion which lays emphasis on giving the women their due rights. Similarly, the U.S.-based Muslim Women's League asserts that spiritual equality, responsibility, and accountability for both men and women is a well-developed theme in the Quran. Spiritual equality between men and women in the sight of God is not limited to purely spiritual, religious issues, but is the basis for equality in all temporal aspects of human endeavor. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair would probably agree, as he once remarked, "To me, the most remarkable thing about the Quran is how progressive it is. The Quran is inclusive. It extols science and knowledge and abhors superstition. It is practical and far ahead of its time in attitudes toward marriage, women, and governance." Even Allah himself is cited as supporting equality, assuring the believers in the Quran that, "Never will I suffer to be lost the work of any of you, be he male or female." Surah 3, verse 195. All will be rewarded. Whoever works righteously, man or woman, and has faith, verily to him will we give a new life, a life that is good and pure, and we will bestow on such their reward according to the best of their actions. Surah 16, verse 97. And it seemingly gets even better. The Quran says that Allah created men and women from a single soul. Surah 4, verse 1. Many Muslims in the West have pointed to this verse as evidence that Islam recognizes the full human dignity of women. A 20th century Iranian Shiite scholar, Ayatollah Murtada Mutahari, says that other religions also have referred to this question, but it is the Quran alone which in a number of verses expressly says that woman has been created of the species of man, and both man and woman have the same innate character. He then quotes Surah 4, verse 1. Crooked women, But once again, other verses and traditions undermine the Quran's ostensibly progressive injunctions. In this case, the single soul from which mankind was created was Adam's. And while the biblical story of Eve's creation from Adam's rib is not repeated here, the Prophet of Islam refers to that story in a hadith, suggesting that while men and women may have the same innate character, that doesn't mean they are equal in dignity, for women are crooked. Woman has been created from a rib and will in no way be straightened for you. So if you wish to benefit by her while crookedness remains in her. And if you attempt to straighten her, you will break her, and breaking her is divorcing her. Women are inherently crooked? Certainly some Muslim clerics think so, or at least they do not believe in legal equality for women. Bangladeshi Islamic cleric Mufti Fazlul Haq Amani read the same Quran that Tony Blair found so progressive and yet complained about attempts in his native country to establish equal property rights for women. The problem? That would be directly against Islam and the Holy Quran. And where do Muslims get such ideas? They stem from the overall inferior status of women promulgated in the Quran, which specifically refutes the notion that women have as much basic human dignity as men. To the contrary, Allah says men are superior. When giving regulations for divorce, Allah stipulates that women have rights similar to those of men over them in kindness. Similar, but not identical, for men are a degree above them. Surah 2, verse 228. Far from mandating equality, the Quran portrays women as essentially possessions of men. The Quran likens a woman to a field, or a tilth, to be used by a man as he wills. Your women are a tilth for you to cultivate, so go to your tilth as you will. Surah 2, verse 223. And in a tradition, Muhammad details the qualities of a good wife, including that she obeys when instructed, and the husband is pleased to look at her. The Quran decrees women's subordination to men in numerous other verses. It declares that a woman's legal testimony is worth half that of a man. Get 2 witnesses out of your own men, and if there are not 2 men, then a man and 2 women, such as ye choose for witnesses, so that if one of them errs, the other can remind her. Surah 2, verse 282. It allows men to marry up to 4 wives, and also to have sex with slave girls. If ye fear that ye shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if ye fear that ye shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or a captive that your right hands possess, that will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. Surah 4, verse 3. It rules that a son's inheritance should be twice the size of that of a daughter. Allah thus directs you as regards your children's inheritance. To the male, a portion equal to that of 2 females. Surah 4, verse 11. It allows for marriage to prepubescent girls, stipulating that Islamic divorce procedures shall apply to those who have not yet menstruated. Surah 65, verse 4. Even some passages that appear to benefit women don't end up doing so. The Quran requires a husband to give his wife a dowry, Surah 4, verse 4. The wife, however, may choose to free the husband from this obligation. If the wife gives him part or all of that dowry with a good heart, her husband is allowed to take it. In reality, this supposed choice is sometimes forced on women and justified by this Quranic verse. These passages are not archaisms or dead letters. They are imposed wherever Islamic law is enforced, as in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where large numbers of women turned out during the June 2009 post-election demonstrations. Clearly, these women's grievances went far beyond a single rigged election. One explained, "I see lots of girls and women in these demonstrations. They are all angry, ready to explode, scream out, and let the world hear their voice. I want the world to know that as a woman in this country, I have no freedom." This is not surprising, since Iranian law was formulated in scrupulous adherence to the Quran and Islamic tradition and law. Even the Ayatollah Khomeini's granddaughter, Zahra Eshraghi, declared that under Islamic law, a woman is there to fill her husband's stomach and raise children. And just weeks after President Barack Obama defended the right of women in non-Muslim countries to cover their heads, brave Iranian women were throwing off their head coverings as a sign of protest against the Islamic regime, with no peep of support from Obama. Journalist Azeda Mavini, author of the feminist book Lipstick Jihad, noted that, while it's not at the top of women's grievances, the hijab is symbolic. Taking it off is like waving a red flag. Women are saying they are a force to be reckoned with. The deficiency of a woman's mind. Laying out rules of evidence, the Quran directs those trying to make a legal case to get 2 witnesses out of your own men, and if there are not 2 men, then a man and 2 women, such as ye choose for witnesses, so that if one of them errs, the other can remind her. Surah 2, verse 282. Muhammad used this verse to argue that women were deficient in intelligence as well as in religious faith. According to an Islamic tradition, Muhammad was on his way to offer prayer one day when he passed by a group of women. He stopped to exhort them to charity, basing his exhortation upon a warning. O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were you, women. Asked to explain his comments, he responded, You curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you. When pressed further, he invoked Quran, Surah 2, verse 282. Is not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man? When the women admitted that this was indeed the case, Muhammad drove his case home. This is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't it true that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menses? When they admitted this also, he concluded, This is the deficiency in her religion. Such attitudes, enunciated by the Prophet of Islam himself, are pervasive and corrosive in the Islamic world. And for women, it gets worse. How's that again? The Quran instructs children to be good to their parents. This command holds true even if they are unbelievers. But if they strive to make thee join in worship with me things of which thou hast no knowledge, obey them not. This refusal to follow them into idolatry, however, doesn't mean one should be unkind to them. Yet bear them company in this life with justice and consideration. Surah 31, verses 14 and 15. And yet maybe it does. The Quran elsewhere commands Muslims not to love unbelievers, even if they are among one's closest relatives. Thou wilt not find folk who believe in Allah and the last day, loving those who oppose Allah and His Messenger, even though they be their fathers, or their sons, or their brethren, or their clan. Surah 58, verse 22. Easy divorce and temporary husbands. A Muslim man may divorce his wife simply by saying, talaq, I divorce you. But unsurprisingly, women may not divorce their husbands in this way. After a Muslim husband tells his wife he is divorcing her, the Quran directs that divorced women shall wait concerning themselves for 3 monthly periods in order to determine whether or not they are pregnant. If the divorcing couple has children, they ordinarily go with the father, and he owes his wife no financial or any other kind of support. During that time span, their husbands have the better right to take them back if they wish for reconciliation. Women shall have rights similar to the rights against them, according to what is equitable, but men have a degree of advantage over them. Surah 2, verse 228. Talaq. It's that easy. And that very simplicity gives rise to abuses, some of which the Quran anticipates. A man may, after all, pronounce talaq upon his wife in a fit of temper, but then reconsider. Accordingly, the Quran says that a divorce is only permissible twice, After that, the parties should either hold together on equitable terms or separate with kindness. Surah 2, verse 229. This passage seems to envision marriage, at least for Muslim women, as something akin to a hostage situation. For the Quran goes on to direct that if the couple would be unable to keep the limits ordained by Allah, then there is no blame on either of them if she gives something for her freedom, or, in Pickthall's translation, ransom herself. But after 3 talaqs, the divorce is irrevocable, until a certain condition is met. After a man divorces his wife 3 times, he cannot after that remarry her until after she has married another husband and he has divorced her. Surah 2, verse 230. This has led to the phenomenon of temporary husbands who marry and divorce thrice divorced women at the behest of Islamic clerics, so that these poor women can then return to their original husbands. This practice is sanctioned by no less an authority than Muhammad himself. A woman once came to him with an unusual problem. She had been divorced by her husband, had married another man, and now wanted to remarry her first husband. But her second husband was impotent. Unyielding, Muhammad told her that she could not remarry her first husband unless you had a complete sexual relation with your present husband, and he enjoys a complete sexual relation with you. Predictably, this odd requirement has resulted in all kinds of strange and abusive situations. In India in 2006, a drunk man divorced his wife 3 times. Afterward, he tried to keep his rash talaqs a secret, but word got out in the village, whereupon the local Islamic clerics declared the divorce binding and stipulated that he and his wife could not lawfully reconcile until she married and divorced another man. In the Maldives 5 years earlier, a temporary husband spent the night with his new wife, only to renege on his agreement to divorce her after 1 night, much to her fury and that of her original husband. Temporary wives, too, at least for Shiites. Quran, Surah 4, verse 24, says, "And those of whom ye seek content by marrying them, give unto them their portions as a duty. And there is no sin for you in what ye do by mutual agreement after the duty hath been done." From the phrase, "what ye do by mutual agreement," Shiite Muslims have gleaned permission to enter into marriages that have a time limit. A couple may marry one another for 1 night, or a weekend, or a month, or any limit they choose. One tradition stipulates that a temporary marriage should last for 3 nights, and if they like to continue, they can do so, and if they want to separate, they can do so. In a temporary marriage, the duration of the marriage is specified at its beginning, and after it ends, the couple parts without further ado. Unsurprisingly, temporary wives often congregate in seminary towns, such as the holy city of Qom, where many lonely young men with a bit of money can be found. One young seminarian in the early 1900s recounted his experience with a woman he married for a while. After he had paid her and the marriage expired, he remembered the experience with satisfaction and made an arresting comparison. It is reported that the imams have said that whoever makes love legitimately has in effect killed an infidel. That means killing the lascivious spirit. How reassuring for infidels. Marrying young, very young. The Quran takes child marriage for granted in its directives about divorce. Discussing the waiting period required in order to determine if a woman is pregnant, it says, "If you are in doubt concerning those of your wives who have ceased menstruating, know that their waiting period shall be 3 months. The same shall apply to those who have not yet menstruated." Surah 65, verse 4. Allah thus gives instructions for a situation in which a prepubescent woman is not only married, but is being divorced by her husband. Such a verse might have made its way into the Quran because of the notorious fact that Muhammad himself had a child bride. According to Sahih Bukhari, the hadith collection that Muslims consider most reliable, the Prophet married her when she was 6 years old, and he consummated his marriage when she was 9 years old, and then she remained with him for 9 years, that is, till his death. Another tradition recalls that at the age of 9 she was playing on a swing with some of her friends when Muhammad came for her. This behavior by the man whom hundreds of millions of Muslims regard as the exemplar standard of conduct has brought suffering to untold numbers of women and girls. One Islamic land where child marriage is common, in fact more common than anywhere else in the world, is northern Nigeria, where Sharia is in force. The Nigerian government has tried to stamp out the practice, passing a law in 2003, the Child Rights Act, that set the minimum age for marriage at 18. Islamic clerics have been the fiercest opponents of this law. Imam Sani, a Nigerian cleric, explained, "Child marriage in Islam is permissible. In the Quran there is no specific age of marriage. Consequently, the Muslim clerics have a problem with this Child Rights Act, and they decried it. They castigate it, they reject it, and they don't want it introduced in Nigeria. If the government enforce the law," Sani said, "there will be violent conflict from the Muslims, saying that no, we will not accept this. We'd rather die than accept something that is not a law from Allah." Nigeria is made up of 36 states, of which 18 have passed the Child Rights Act. However, only one of Nigeria's majority Muslim states has passed the law, and that with a change that set puberty, rather than the age of 18, as the minimum requirement for lawful marriage. The result? As many as 800,000 Nigerian women are afflicted with fistula, a disease resulting from early intercourse and pregnancy. Nigeria is not alone, either in the prevalence of child marriage or in attempts to end the practice. In September 2008, Moroccan officials closed 60 Quranic schools operated by Sheikh Mohammed bin Abderrahman al-Maghrawi because he issued a decree justifying marriage to girls as young as 9. The Sheikh, according to Agence France-Presse, said his decree was based on the fact that the Prophet Muhammad consummated his marriage to his favorite wife when she was that age. It should come as no surprise, then, given the words of the Quran about divorcing prepubescent women and Muhammad's example in marrying Aisha, that in some areas of the Islamic world the practice of child marriage enjoys the blessing of the law. Time magazine reported in 2001 that in Iran the legal age for marriage is 9 for girls, 14 for boys, and notes that the law has occasionally been exploited by pedophiles who marry poor young girls from the provinces, use and then abandon them. In 2000, the Iranian parliament voted to raise the minimum age for girls to 14, but this year, a legislative oversight body dominated by traditional clerics vetoed the move. Likewise, the New York Times reported in 2008 that in Yemen, despite a rising tide of outrage, the fight against the practice is not easy. Hardline Islamic conservatives, whose influence has grown enormously in the past 2 decades, defend it, pointing to the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to a 9-year-old. The characterization of proponents of Islamic law as conservatives is notable. The Times does not seem fazed by the fact that conservatives in the U.S. are not typically advocates of child marriage. And so child marriage remains prevalent in many areas of the Islamic world. In 2007, photographer Stephanie Sinclair won the UNICEF Photo of the Year competition for a wedding photograph of an Afghani couple. The groom was said to be 40 years old but looked older. The bride was 11. UNICEF patroness Eva Louise Kohler explained, "The UNICEF Photo of the Year 2007 raises awareness about a worldwide problem. Millions of girls are married while they are still underage. Most of these child brides are forever denied a self-determined life. According to UNICEF, about half the women in Afghanistan are married before they reach the age of 18. Like Brigham Young, only more so. The Quran allows a man to take as many as 4 wives, as long as he believes he can deal justly with all of them. Surah 4, verse 3. For according to one hadith, Muhammad said, "The person who has 2 wives, but is not just between them, shall appear on the day of judgment in such a condition that one half of his body will be collapsing." Nonetheless, what constitutes just behavior is in the eye of the beholder. And Muslim theologians have noticed that the Quran says that one must treat all one's wives justly, not equally. Thus, Ibn Kathir surmises that this requirement is really no big deal. It is not obligatory to treat them equally. Rather, it is recommended. So if one does so, that is good, and if not, there is no harm on him. Muhammad Assad justified this inequality by pointing to biological realities. One might ask why the same latitude has not been given to women as well, but the answer is simple. Notwithstanding the spiritual factor of love which influences the relations between man and woman, the determinate biological reason for the sexual urge is, in both sexes, procreation. And whereas a woman can at one time conceive a child from one man only, and has to carry it for 9 months before she can conceive another, a man can beget a child every time he cohabits with a woman. Thus, while nature would have been merely wasteful if it had produced a polygamous instinct in woman, man's polygamous inclination is biologically justified. Enjoining divine sanction, polygamy is legally practiced in a majority of Islamic countries worldwide. And with large-scale Islamic immigration to the West, polygamy is increasing throughout Europe as well, with estimates of polygamous arrangements reaching up to 16,000 in Italy alone. Britain appears to be a bit behind the curve. The Toronto Sun reported in 2008 that the British government recently admitted that nearly 1,000 men are living legally with multiple wives in Britain. It is perhaps unsurprising that polygamy is vociferously defended in the West by some Muslim immigrants. In 2004, the Islamic Culture Center of Norway, which receives money from the Norwegian government, declared that polygamy is advantageous and ought to be practiced where conditions lend themselves to such a practice. What does come as a rude surprise, however, is the blithe acceptance of the practice by supine, politically correct Western governments. In February 2008, for example, the British government allowed men with multiple wives to claim extra welfare benefits. North America is not exempt from this trend. In Canada, Mumtaz Ali, president of the Canadian Society of Muslims, spoke approvingly of the spread of polygamy, declaring in 2008 that polygamy is a regular part of life for many Muslims. Ontario recognizes religious marriages for Muslims and others. He said that there were several hundred Muslim men practicing polygamy in the Toronto area. Quranic polygamy has also come to the United States. In November 2007, a Muslim woman sent a letter to Board of Directors of the Islamic Center of New England, complaining that her husband was able to marry illegally and secretly, and without my knowledge, 3 American Muslim women. And because of that, myself and my children have suffered, and still suffer tremendously. She laid some of the responsibility at the feet of the leaders of the Islamic Center. Because of the failure of the Islamic Center, as well as the imams to prevent such misconduct, I had no choice but to file for divorce. She threatened to expose this misconduct to the court and media if I have to. I also hope through this letter that you will make sure that this victimization doesn't happen to any other sisters. This is no isolated case. According to researcher David Rusin, estimates for the United States typically run into the tens of thousands of polygamous unions. In May 2008, researchers estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 Muslims were living in polygamous arrangements in the United States. And Muslim imams don't seem concerned about U.S. laws forbidding the practice. Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations asserted that a minority of Muslims in America were polygamous, and that Islamic scholars would differ on whether one could do so while living in the United States. He didn't say anything about the necessity of obeying U.S. laws in this regard. Toronto Imam Ali Hindi explained that such laws have no force for Muslims. This is in our religion, and nobody can force us to do anything against our religion. If the laws of the country conflict with Islamic law, if one goes against the other, then I am going to follow Islamic law. Simple as that. The Quran has further gifts for men as well. As we have seen, it stipulates that if a man cannot deal justly with multiple wives, then he should marry only one, or resort to the captives that your right hands possess, that is, slave girls. Surah 4, verse 3. Divinely sanctioned wife-beating. There is no basis in Islamic theology to support domestic abuse of any kind, declared Kanta A. Ahmed, author of In the Land of Invisible Women, A Female Doctor's Journey in the Saudi Kingdom, in May 2009. But it all depends on one's definition of abuse. Wife-beating exists in all cultures, but only in Islam does it enjoy divine sanction. The Quran tells men to beat their disobedient wives after first warning them and then sending them to sleep in separate beds. Surah 4, verse 34. A punishment that suggests the Quran regards women as sexually insatiable and needing to be kept under control. This is, of course, an extremely controversial verse, so it is worth noting how several translators render the key word here, wadribuhunna. Pickthall translates it, and scourge them. Yusuf Au translates it, and last beat them lightly. Al-Hilali Khan translates it, and last beat them lightly if it is useful. Shakir, and beat them. Sher Ali, and chastise them. Khalifa, then you may, as a last alternative, beat them. Arbery, and beat them. Rodwell, and scourge them. Sale, and chastise them. Assad, then beat them. Dawood, and beat them. In a new, widely publicized translation of the Quran, however, Muslim feminist Lali Bakhtiar translates it as, go away from them. In light of the unanimity among translators, both Muslim and non-Muslim, this seems difficult to sustain. It is hard to believe that all these authorities on Quranic Arabic, spanning several centuries, got the passage wrong until Bakhtiar. But her impulse to mitigate the brute force of this verse is understandable, as many Muslims today regard it with acute embarrassment. Assad adduces numerous traditions in which Muhammad forbade the beating of any woman, concluding that wife-beating is barely permissible and should preferably be avoided. Unfortunately, however, this is not a unanimous view. In his Quranic commentary, Ruhul Ma'ani, Sheikh Syed Mahmud Alusi gives 4 reasons that a man may beat his wife. If she refuses to beautify herself for him, if she refuses sex when he asks for it, if she refuses to pray or perform ritual ablutions, and if she goes out of the house without a valid excuse. What's more, the propriety of wife-beating is reinforced in the Hadith. Western apologists for Islam like to point to a Hadith in which Muhammad held up a toothbrush in response to a question from his followers about the proper implement for beating one's wife. He was brushing his teeth when they approached him. In practice, however, Muhammad himself didn't always counsel such gentleness, and the early Muslims certainly didn't practice it. Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, said it herself, "I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women." Muhammad was once told that women have become emboldened towards their husbands, whereupon he gave permission to beat them. He wasn't happy with the women who complained, not with their husbands who beat them. Also, Aisha reports that Muhammad struck her, and remember, Muhammad's example is normative for Muslims, since he is an excellent example of conduct, Surah 33, verse 21. Once he went out at night after he thought she was asleep, and she followed him surreptitiously. Muhammad saw her and, as Aisha recounts, he struck me on the chest, which caused me pain, and then said, "Did you think that Allah and His Apostle would deal unjustly with you?" Many influential Muslims take all this seriously. In spring 2005, when the East African nation of Chad tried to institute a new family law that would outlaw wife-beating, Muslim clerics protested that the measure was un-Islamic. A 2007 survey of hospital workers in Turkey found 69% of the women and 85% of the men agreed that under some circumstances, a husband was justified in beating his wife. Among the acceptable circumstances were criticizing the male. As many as 20% of women, even in the moderate land of Tunisia, are victims of spousal abuse. In September 2007, the Islamic cleric Muhammad al-Arifi explained on Saudi and Kuwaiti television, in line with the three-tiered approach counseled by Quran, Surah 4, verse 34, "Admonish them once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times. If this doesn't help, refuse to share their beds. And if that doesn't work?" Al-Arifi asked his audience. One young man replied, "Beat them." "That's right," Al-Arifi responded. Then he explained the parameters. Beating in the face is forbidden, even when it comes to animals. If you want your camel or donkey to start walking, you are not allowed to beat it in the face. If this is true for animals, it is all the more true when it comes to humans. So beatings should be light, and not in the face. If he beats her, the beatings must be light and must not make her face ugly. He must beat her where it will not leave marks. He should not beat her on the hand. He should beat her in some places where it will not cause any damage. He should not beat her like he would beat an animal or a child, slapping them right and left. In January 2009, Australian Islamic cleric Samir Abu Hamza likewise echoed the Quranic injunction. First of all, advise them. You beat them, but this is the last resort. If you have advised them not to be disobedient for a long, long time, then you smack them, you beat them, and please, brothers, calm down. The beating that Muhammad showed is like the toothbrush that you use to brush your teeth. You are not allowed to bruise them. You are not allowed to make them bleed. Unfortunately, men have differing ideas about what constitutes a light beating. Sanctioning the beating of women in the first place will inevitably lead to serious violence. A prominent American Muslim leader, Dr. Muzammil H. Siddiqui, former president of the Islamic Society of North America, the ISNA, has said that in some cases a husband may use some light disciplinary action in order to correct the moral infraction of his wife. The Quran is very clear on this issue. Indeed, it is. Stoning adulterers. Not in the Quran. Allah mandates home imprisonment until death, unless Allah ordained for them some other way, for women found guilty of lewdness on the testimony of 4 witnesses. Surah 4, verse 15. According to Islamic law, these 4 witnesses must be male Muslims. Women's testimony is inadmissible in cases of a sexual nature, even in rape cases in which she is the victim. If a woman is found guilty of adultery, she is to be stoned to death. If she is found guilty of fornication, she gets 100 lashes. Surah 24, verse 2. But why should a woman be stoned to death for adultery when the Quran doesn't mandate this punishment? Because even though this verse has dropped out of the perfect and eternal book, it has not dropped out of the memories of Islamic jurists. As we have seen, the penalty of stoning does not appear in the Quranic text as it stands now. But adulterers in Islamic lands are still risking their lives. Umar, one of Muhammad's early companions and the second caliph, insisted that it had originally been in the Quran, had been practiced by Muhammad, and was the will of Allah. For men, however, the atmosphere is very different. If 2 men among you are guilty of lewdness, says the Quran, punish them both. If they repent and amend, leave them alone. For Allah is oft returning, most merciful. Surah 4, verse 16. The Tafsir al-Jalalain says that lewdness refers to men who commit fornication or sodomy. They are to be punished by cursing them and beating them with sandals. And if they repent of it and reform their behavior, leave them alone and do not harm them. However, men don't get off entirely scot-free. The commentary adds that this verse was abrogated by the had, or prescribed, punishment for fornication, that is, stoning. The Islamic jurist al-Shafi'i, it goes on, says that someone who is guilty of sodomy is not to be stoned, in his view, even if he has been married. Instead, he is to be flogged and banished. Cover up, or else. In his much praised June 4, 2009 speech in Cairo, reaching out to the Islamic world, President Barack Obama declared, I reject the view of some in the West that a woman who chooses to cover her hair is somehow less equal. He also noted that the U.S. government has gone to court to protect the right of women and girls to wear the hijab, that is, headscarf, and to punish those who would deny it. One may legitimately wonder, however, if Muslim women who wish to cover their heads in the United States really face the same kind of obstacles that both Muslim and non-Muslim women in the Islamic world often face when they refuse to cover their heads. As women's rights activist Phyllis Chesler notes, in Algeria, as in Iran, unveiled, educated, independent Algerian women have been seen as military targets and increasingly shot on sight. In February 2007, Zilla Huma Usman, the Pakistani government's Minister for Social Welfare in Punjab province, was shot dead by a Muslim because her head was uncovered. The murderer, Muhammad Sawar, declared, "I have no regrets. I just obeyed Allah's commandment. I will kill all those women who do not follow the right path if I am freed again." Allah's commandment comes in the Quranic injunction that women should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, or the slaves whom their right hands possess, or male servants free of physical needs, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex. Surah 24, verse 31. In other words, they should be covered up whenever they venture out in public. Ibn Kathir explains that this is not a matter of choice. This is a command from Allah to the believing women, and jealousy on His part over the wives of His believing servants. It is also to distinguish the believing women from the women of the society of unbelievers and the deeds of the pagan women. But what exactly should they cover? The Tafsir al-Jalalain explains that this verse instructs women to cover everything except the face and the hands when in public. In a hadith, Aisha recounts that Muhammad said that when a woman reaches the age of menstruation, it does not suit her that she displays her parts of body except this and this, and he pointed to her face and hands. Even today, some Muslims use this hadith to justify mandating the hijab for women. In another hadith, a woman with a veil over her face came to see Muhammad. She was looking for her son, who had been killed in battle. Muhammad asked her, "Have you come here asking for your son while veiling your face?" She responded, "If I am afflicted with the loss of my son, I shall not suffer the loss of my modesty." Pleased, Muhammad told her, "You will get the reward of 2 martyrs for your son, because the people of the book have killed him." The same Quranic verse mandating that women veil themselves also says, "And let them not stamp their feet so as to reveal what they hide of their adornment." Ibn Kathir continues, "During Jahiliyyah, when women walked in the street wearing anklets and no one could hear them, they would stamp their feet so that men could hear their anklets ringing. Allah forbade the believing women to do this. Furthermore, women are also prohibited from wearing scent and perfume when they are going outside the home, lest men should smell their perfume. Can't have that. The Hadith illuminates the Quran. Avoiding cross-eyed children. I must ask the listener's pardon. The Hadiths in this chapter are, shall we say, a bit R-rated. Listener's discretion is advised. According to Islamic tradition, the Quranic verse calling women a tilth for men was revealed because of the Jews, who used to say that when one comes to one's wife through the vagina, but being on her back, and she becomes pregnant, the child has a squint, or according to other sources, is cross-eyed. To refute this, Allah revealed that it didn't matter whether she was lying on her back. Your wives are your tilth. Go then unto your tilth as you may desire. Surah 2, verse 223. Sayyid Qutb says the use of the word tilth, with its connotations of tillage and production, is most fitting in a context of fertility and procreation. Or as Maududi puts it, Allah's purpose in the creation of women is not merely to provide men with recreation. Not merely recreation. Women were also created in order to provide men with children. The Hadith illuminates the Quran, long before Monica's blue dress. I asked Aisha about the clothes soiled with semen. She replied, I used to wash it off the clothes of Allah's Messenger, and he would go for the salat, the prayer, while water spots were still visible.